This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Brian Kwoba, who teaches in the Department of History at University of Memphis, where he is also the Director of African American Studies. Along with a number of scholarly articles, Brian is the author of the new book, Hubert Harrison, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism, out in 2025 with the University of North Carolina Press. In this conversation, we discuss the role of Black studies sensibilities in the writing of history and the importance of the long story of Black radicalism for the study of Black life. Brian, good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm great, John. Thanks so much for having me.
Super excited to have you on the podcast. We're recording this during our little bit of hiatus in the middle here of July, but you'll be part of our sort of next push into the second season. I mean, we're not designating them as seasons, but part of our push into this sort of second phase of the podcast. And I'm really interested to hear about your take on Black studies, how you understand your work in relation to it, which I think is super interesting and super important. And I just have to say, you teach at my alma mater, so I'm always more than a little bit partial to University of Memphis folks. There have been a few on the podcast, so I'm extra happy about that, which is just a long way of saying, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. It's great to be here with a fellow University of Memphis alumnus.
I have to say, too, I said this on a couple before, I was actually there when it was still Memphis State for a couple of years.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's you're an OG.
That's how I put it. That's how I emphasize the gray on my facial hair. That's when I say I was there when it was with Memphis State, when Anthony Hardaway was had his injury year and then came back and all the glory and all those days. But anyway, we'll have a chance to talk about how you understand the field of Black studies, how you understand your work in relation to it, historical study in relation to these kinds of questions. But I wanted to start out with, in some ways, more personal question or more individual question, which is to ask you, what drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to Black studies, whether that's a sort of personal journey, ancestral even, key courses, sort of moments of intellectual or cultural life. What drew you to the study of Black life? What keeps you committed to it? And what drew you to Black studies as a field?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think at a most sort of basic level, my father is from Kenya, and my mother is, from the United States, a white American. And so having that mixed racial and ethnic heritage has made for a journey in life in which questions of race, questions of identity, questions of belonging have been ones that I've, really spent a lot of time with. And, as a person with an African American identity, as well as a Kenyan and an African identity, questions of Blackness and what it means to be Black, which varies depending on what country you're in some ways, have been really intriguing for me and part of my own attempt to understand my own place in the world. And so Black studies, is a natural place to go for some of the answers and further questions that can help illuminate a life like mine.
How did that sort of translate then? Was it something that sort of animated you like as a child and through high school? And then sort of your undergraduate and graduate work sort of crystallized it or gave it sort of new venues? Or were there sort of moments in higher ed that were really formative or sort of gave shape to these questions and curiosities that you had?
Great question. Yeah, so actually it wasn't until my undergraduate experience at Cornell University where I really first had to lean more into what some of the questions that I just mentioned are questions of like, what does it mean to be Black? Because I grew up, my parents split when I was very young, and I grew up with my mother and my mother's side of the family. So, and I grew up in Boulder, Colorado. So it was, pretty much an all-white environment. My schooling, my cousins, aunts, uncles, grandmother, that was the world that I was in. And so once I got to Cornell, it was the first time where I was around a lot of Black students. For example, my high school had, literally 2 of us, and it was me and Daryl and 1,000 other people. so,
Wow.
so at Cornell, we had the Africana Studies Center at Cornell. We had the Ujamaa residential facility for students of African descent. A whole an NAACP chapter on campus. Black student organizations, so there was just a lot more going on at Cornell than I'd ever seen in my experience. And so that was the beginning of a longer journey that would come to fruition after Cornell as I got into activism and some of the political questions of how to make social change, in this country and in the world, that really kind of set me down a more forthright study of people of African descent and, Black studies, as it were. I never liked history, by the way.
Really?
Yeah.
So you're not one of these people who was like, I was always really into history books and now I'm an historian?
Nope. I never liked history. To me, it was always just this boring sort of memorizing of names and dates. And I just thought it was the past. History is in the past and it's a dead letter and there's nothing more to say about it. In my senior year of Cornell, I became an activist after a trip to Cuba that I had taken to study music in the summer before my senior year. And that trip to Cuba really sparked a whole number of questions that I just couldn't answer with the level of political consciousness that I had at that time. And so when I got back to Cornell for my senior year, that's when I started taking some politically oriented classes, but still no history. I started reading history and I started realizing the value of history because I was determined to change the world when I came back from Cuba. And I pretty quickly realized that if you want to change something, it helps to understand how it got to be the way it is. And so history became much more compelling once I realized I needed to know some history if I wanted to change the world that we have. And so, I joined a socialist organization, the ISO, started reading, Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky. And then I was in my classes that year, I had a couple radical professors. So reading Marx and just a number of different, kind of radical socialist, communist, anarchist things kind of really opened up my mind and kind of radicalized me politically, which then set the stage for me to kind of go forth and study further in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Cuba has that effect on so many people, and it's sort of interesting just, talking about how sort of had these questions as a young person. You end up just ending up at Cornell, and then Cuba is just so plugged into so much of the Black studies imagination. I think about, the significance of Cornell's founding as an Africana or Black studies department, which was at gunpoint. I mean, it was a militant struggle.
Yep.
This was not we filed a bunch of petitions. And just the place of Cuba in the Black radical tradition, that was, where, it's where the Black Panthers went, where they fled or where they went for, political education and so forth. So it's a kind of an amazing sort of set of things to come together there. And carry, the stuff we all carry with us. So, and I'm interested then, maybe this has some relationship to this moment in Cuba or radical politics or even the Cornell Africana Studies Center. I know that you direct African American studies at University of Memphis, and so that means you have a longstanding and current work in terms of thinking about what is this field of Black studies. So I'm interested to hear you talk about the portrait of Black studies you work with. What's the Black studies? What is Black studies in your imagination. And I want to ask this in the context of its origin story, which was, on the one hand, a demand by students that there be a place to study Black life, that disciplines had not sufficiently made this possible, if at all possible. And that Black studies was going to be where Black art, Black history, Black politics could be studied. And out of that has grown this immense appreciation and proliferation of the intellectual tradition. But of course, this was late 1960s, early 1970s, where the radicalization of Black liberation struggle had really broken down those boundaries we might comfortably have between, campus and community, between politics and study, between radical liberation struggle and writing and books. And so there's also that political imperative at the heart of Black studies that it be committed to this community transformation. I won't say that they're incompatible, but they have a tension between them. And I think that tension persists to this day in how we think about the meaning of Black studies, between its commitment to an intellectual tradition to study and its commitment to Black liberation study, struggle and community. So I'm curious for you in that sort of context, how do you imagine the field?
Yeah, well, I think that, the 1960s, as you mentioned, was a major turning point for Black studies. As you mentioned, my alma mater, Cornell, was a place where it was very militant, right? In 1969, Black students literally took over with arms one of the buildings on campus, demanding a whole number of things. And that's, it's that level of militant armed struggle on campus that actually produces something like an Africana Studies and Research Center with a PhD in Africana Studies, right? Not something that Black studies programs always or necessarily are able to have. Dr. James Turner, I have to shout out, one of the key founding fathers of Africana Studies at Cornell is somebody, it's funny, actually, I actually started to take a course with Dr. James Turner as an undergrad at Cornell, and I couldn't handle it. It's funny now that I'm, a historian and director of African and African American studies myself, but at that time, it was so far over my head with my racially unconscious, upbringing in Boulder, Colorado. I couldn't handle his course. I literally dropped out after a week or two because it was way above my capacity. And then later, later on, after I graduated from Cornell, I lived in Ithaca for 2 years after that. And I actually got to know Dr. Turner and developed a rapport with him. And I had been politicized and radicalized in my senior year after I tried to take his course. And so we ended up having a great personal relationship and a nice rapport. But it's always funny to remember that, when I was an undergrad, I couldn't even handle his class. But anyway,
I imagine that was like totally satisfying to him, actually. Like my course was so politically intense that somebody was driven away from it and had to go to Cuba to prepare himself. I kind of like this as a narrative.
Yeah. I wish I could ask him what he made of that now. Of course, he's transitioned. May he rest in power. But I said that the 60s is a turning point because, I have a new book out on Hubert Harrison. It's called Hubert Harrison, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism. And one of the things that is notable about Harrison, among many, is that, he was doing what we now think of as Black studies back in the early 20th century, and working with people like Arturo Schomburg and John Edward Bruce, his mentors in the study of African people. They created the Negro Society for Historical Research, which is one of the kind of early examples of an organization that was bringing people together outside the academy. Right. This is not within a university or a formal academic institution, but it's an independent sort of research hub that was bringing together African American, like John Edward Bruce, and Afro-Caribbean, like Schomburg and Harrison, together into a single organization to study, people of African descent and Black history and things of that nature. And Harrison ended up eventually teaching a course at NYU in the 1920s which as far as I can tell is probably the first course ever taught, at least at NYU, with a majority Black syllabus, right, in terms of the readings and the scholars and thinkers. And so that's a kind of Black studies, right, in the 1920s or in the 1910s, if we're talking about the Negro Society for Historical Research, which in many ways seeds and prepares the ground for the larger Black studies that we think of as coming from the 60s, right? I mean, figures like John Henrik Clarke, who were in many ways a spearhead of that movement in the 60s, are coming out of a tradition, at least in Dr. Clarke's case, in Harlem, right? That Harrison and Schomburg and J.A. Rogers and some other folks, Willis Huggins, John G. Jackson, that they had established and so when Dr. Clarke gets to Harlem, having read an article by Schomburg about the Negro rediscovering his past, he's kind of stepping into a tradition and then able to obviously amplify that in the 60s onward as part of a larger Black studies tradition that I think is really important.
And how do you think sort of telling that story? Because I think I haven't had a chance to read your book, but I ordered it when we arranged the podcast. So
thank you.
I've contributed my like 3 cents or whatever to your what do they call it, where you get your
royalties?
Royalties. So like 3 cents to your royalties, as well as to my library. But everybody should order all books they can for their libraries. So I'll just give that little pitch here. But I'm curious how you think this sort of research, especially the way you told that there, how you think this research sort of shifts the field of how we understand the field of Black studies, and how is it kind of compatible with, or how does it just not tell the same story, but tell a story about how we understand Black studies, but also push a new horizon? Because I do think somebody like Harrison has this historical significance. Anybody who works side by side with Schomburg, ought to be a name that's on the tip of our tongue, but isn't. I don't think in Black studies. So, but at the same time, this is embedded in this sort of story that we have of the field. So I'm interested how you see your research sort of pushing the field of Black studies in new directions, and also sort of buttressing or deepening the understanding of the field that we already have.
Absolutely. Well, part of what I do is help to excavate a somewhat underappreciated dimension of, the sort of origins of Black study in terms of the Negro Society for Historical Research, and Harrison in particular. Harrison in many ways was a towering influence on the people around him and the people of his time. People like Marcus Garvey, for example, just to give one example. Garvey's original plan was to form a Tuskegee-style institute in Jamaica. That was the original vision for the Universal Negro Improvement Association. When Garvey gets to Harlem, he joins Harrison's Liberty League of Negro Americans in 1917. And it's in Harrison's Liberty League that he learns a whole number of ideological and strategic elements, the race first doctrine, right? The idea of building a mass movement rather than just a brick and mortar school, bringing Afro-Caribbean and African-American and Africans together into a single organization. That's the Liberty League that does that. A tricolor flag for Black liberation. The Liberty League had a black, brown, and yellow before the Garvey movement's red, black, and green. These are some of the elements without which the rise of Garvey and Garveyism as we know it would not have been possible. Particularly the shift from building an industrial school to building a mass movement, because the Garvey movement, as you know, becomes the largest transnational organization of African people in modern history, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. They had branches, all across both banks of the Atlantic Ocean. And so that's just one example of a really decisive impact that Harrison had. But because he was so radical, right, he's been essentially written out of the history, and not so many people know about him. Even many scholars, don't know much about him. And that's why I wrote this book, is to really try to restore his legacy and talk about some of the dimensions of his life as this kind of towering figure of the Black radical tradition that has really not gotten the credit that he's due. And if you trace the lineage of a Malcolm X, for example, right? Malcolm X, both of his parents were in the Garvey movement. The Garvey movement would not have been the Garvey movement without Harrison and the Liberty League. So there's a direct link, to the tradition of Malcolm X. Same with Dr. King, right? Dr. King comes out of a more labor and civil rights orientation as opposed to the Black nationalism of a Malcolm X. But Harrison was a pioneering Black voice in the Socialist Party, right? And influenced people like A. Philip Randolph directly, who in turn would influence the Dr. Kings of the world. And so Harrison is this really interesting kind of unifying link in that he's an ancestor in the Black radical tradition that establishes certain positions that, subsequent generations, including Black socialist and Black communist figures, as well as Black nationalists and Garveyist type figures, would sort of take forward in subsequent decades.
Yeah, no, I think this project is so important for understanding. You've laid it out so nicely for us. People should still read the book, but and just I will also say the little biographical piece that's attached to this podcast will have a link. So if people are listening and wondering about the book, they can click there to the publisher page. But I think these intellectual origin stories are so important and often get oversimplified in the sort of desire to move on to consequences or civil rights, post-civil rights, iterations of these ideas. And so that's just a way of saying, like, I really appreciate this kind of historical origin story work that then I think it makes us have to reassess, as you were indicating there, reassess so many things that we think of as sort of straightforward. There's sort of Malcolm X, there's Marcus Garvey, there's Martin Luther King Jr. and sort of, but what about these other figures and how they connect? So yeah, all the way to say, I think like our understanding of the kinds of political imaginations at the heart of Black studies need this historical detail and variation to also understand the variation of what we mean by the Black radical tradition. So
yeah.
Great. Everybody read the book. So let me ask you a little bit about, and it's related to the book and the kinds of ways you put it together and put your other research together, and also classroom. I'm thinking about, your doctoral work was in a Department of History, right, which is a disciplinary field.
Yep.
And you also work in the Department of History now, but you also work in African American Studies, which is not a disciplinary field. And I'm interested in how that movement between discipline and non-disciplinary orientations in your reading, writing, and teacherly life, how that's impacted how you understand a research project, how you conduct yourself as a researcher, whether that's assembling material or writing. But also I'm always interested in how that movement between discipline and non-discipline impacts how you construct a classroom.
Yeah, well, first, I just want to second the point about buying the book. But I have to say, when you buy this book, you're not just buying a book. You're buying a piece of my heart and soul, because I spent over a decade on this book. It literally started as my dissertation in 2013. And so it's been a lot of years of, writing, reflecting, rewriting, revising. It is my testament, in a word.
I love that.
Thank you. So, but back to your question about, sort of discipline, the multidisciplinary Black studies versus the discipline of history. Excuse me. I feel like I've always been kind of interdisciplinary, at least since graduate school, even though I was in a history, doctoral program. At Oxford, there are no taught courses, no required courses for doctoral students, and no TAing or teaching that's required either. You basically get in and start researching and writing your dissertation from the beginning. And I was fortunate to have a supervisor, Stephen Tuck, who just gave me so much latitude. He's a historian of civil rights, and so, not necessarily an expert in Hubert Harrison or in the Jim Crow era even, but the great thing about Stephen and I, he just really supported my desire to explore Harrison in all the ways that I felt necessary, and so I did not feel bound by the discipline of history as I was a graduate student, and I was able to read widely in Black studies, in sociology, or just different fields whenever I felt it necessary. And so I feel like it's something that I think that's something that many people who are doing African American history almost have to do, right? History is not a particularly theoretical discipline, although we do have sort of frameworks, right, like Marxism or feminism or whatever it might be as historians, but generally it's not a super theory heavy discipline. But if you're doing African American history, there's almost a need for more theoretical and sort of abstract work around questions of race and racial inequality and racial oppression, because you have to understand the particular position of African Americans historically and sort of why and how that came to be. And so I think that just generally there's people who do African American history, even if they're based in a history department, are kind of doing Black studies on some level, because it just really helps. If you want to understand African American history, it helps to have other lenses and other frameworks besides just the kind of traditional historian approach, right? It's more enriching if you can sort of take from other fields and take ideas and perspectives and insights that can then illuminate the historical examples that you want to focus on.
Yeah, I think this is the thing that interests me just broadly as a question of whatever a discipline is. I'm also partially appointed in the English department, and so I work with graduate students and in my own work, right, on African American and Caribbean literature, and just thinking about the Black Americas, whether it's in literature and philosophy and history and art. The multidisciplinary demands are so interesting, like the way the disciplines can't handle the very questions of Black life, right? And so Black studies for me becomes interestingly important, as you were articulating there, as like a sort of shadow mentor or shadow curriculum, right? Of how do you do African American philosophy if you don't understand sort of politics around Reconstruction or the Tuskegee experiment, or these other intellectual disputes that aren't necessarily theoretical but become all of what you said, really. But I think you can translate that into to every discipline. But also history is for me always an interesting discipline, because I do read history books pretty regularly, and its sense of the archive, especially when you get to African American and Afro Caribbean histories, the archive is so proliferated and diverse, right? Just because it's going to have to take into account cultural questions and political demands and so forth. And it's interesting to me. I wanted to ask you just a little bit about, you said it's not particularly theoretical. That was an interesting way that you got into this sort of different demand that the study of African American life has. What is it? What do you think is that theoretical thing that helps make the right kind of shift to give a adequate, legitimate, however you want to characterize it, account of Black life?
Well, I guess there's this kind of way in which African Americans and Black communities more generally are, because we live under this kind of systemic oppression, right? And the color line, right? When Du Bois says the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, like that's a very important thing to grapple with. And so some of the rules or frameworks or theories that may apply on that side of the color line may or may not apply on this side, right? Or may have different dynamics or different kind of parameters, right? And so I think that's why it's really useful to have a grounding in some kind of racial awareness, racial consciousness, critical race theory, for example. If I can use that term in its original meaning.
Please.
Having that lens of analysis, right? That racial inequality, racial oppression exist and have, very clear consequences and roots and dynamics. That's the kind of theory. When I say there's some need for theory to do African American history, like that's kind of what I'm talking about, right? Is that you can't just assume that you're going to be telling stories without needing to reckon with these other factors and dynamics that really shape African American life in particular ways, that not everybody has to grapple with. So, for example, simple example is with my book on Harrison. Harrison, one of the things he tried to do, he was in the Socialist Party. He studied Marx and Kautsky and Eugene Debs. He campaigned for Eugene Debs for president. But he was trying to get the party to take the question of the Black working class more seriously, right? To welcome Black workers, to develop special outreach, to recruit them, to take up specific demands that are particular to the Black working class, ending lynching, right? Ending segregation, ending disfranchisement, ending the epidemic of anti-Black pogroms that were sweeping across the country in the early 20th century. These are things that make the Black working class more oppressed than the average white worker, right? And as Harrison pointed out, Black communities in general were more thoroughly proletarian than any other, precisely because they were brought, right? Enslaved Africans were brought to do work. And so if you have a community that's more thoroughly proletarian and more ruthlessly exploited than any other, you would think that those who stand for proletarian emancipation, in particular the Socialist Party in the 1910s, would place the Black worker at the center of their theoretical and practical activity. But obviously that's not what they did, right? And so those are some of that's one example, I think, of how, you can't take the white world at face value necessarily, even when they say we want a revolution for proletarian emancipation, because if they don't understand the way in which their anti-Black prejudices are already informing what they think of as proletarian, which is to say not including, African Americans, or including them only as an afterthought, then, it sort of raises fundamental questions about the whole edifice of Western thought and, what people have been assuming to be true or universal in some way, shape, or form, which is actually very particular. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, it really does. And I have these moments in so many podcasts where I'm like, podcasts generally super interesting, but these moments, like that moment, makes this whole podcast really worth it. That was really fantastic. I think there's a lot of, there's so much there. And just this, the way you started is like, when you translate anything across that color line, it's fundamentally different, and that's a theoretical problem. It's a readerly problem. It's an interpretation problem. It's a writerly problem. Yeah, no, absolutely. That was fantastic. Thank you for that. I'm glad I asked.
No problem.
Well, let me ask a sort of big speculative question, one of the last two questions for you. When you think about the past of Black studies, I have some sort of ideas where you might go with this. When you think about the past of Black studies and its future, what do you think it has done well? But also, what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Yeah, that's such a interesting question. I think there's a number of things that it has done well. And so one example, just if we're thinking the last 50 years, I think there's been a lot of great work to reclaim Black women within the field of Black studies. Black women's activism, Black women's leadership, Black women's intellectual dynamism and intellectual history. I think that it hasn't done such a great job, though, of integrating that into a larger kind of Black studies frame. In other words, if I can speak historically for a second, when I look at the history of the field, it feels like the first generation or the earliest incarnations of Black studies were mostly male scholars doing the scholarship, and in such a way that perhaps it marginalized or even excluded and ignored Black women, right? And so I get why there's been a reaction to that, and this sort of more recent generation, particularly led by Black women, has sought to restore and reclaim and recenter, any number of different Black women figures and movements in the picture because they were lost or ignored in the earlier incarnations. But that I feel like has kind of gone almost in the opposite direction with similarly risky results. There's works you can read nowadays that only talk about Black women, right? You can read a whole history of the United States that says nothing about African American men or boys. I'm talking about a Black woman's history of the United States. Now that's really interesting as a kind of exercise and as a way to show that, hey, Black women have been here the whole time. But if you find yourself, for example, on a slave ship and the discussion proceeds as though there was not a single man or boy on the slave ships, an outside reader, somebody from China or from Mars, might actually walk away from a book like that thinking that Black men and boys didn't do anything, weren't even around, let alone contributing anything to the struggle. So I think what it hasn't done a good job of, or maybe this is the next task for us in the future, is integrating, right? Neither doing the kind of old school Black male-led studies that excluded and marginalized Black women, nor doing the more new school Black women-led studies that marginalize Black men and boys, but rather integrating, right? Telling the stories in a way that welcomes and invites and includes the contributions of Black men and women and children or young people at times, and elders and non-binary people, and rather than this but not that, or this but not that, right? Which is what I see a lot of in the sort of recent decades.
Yeah, I think that whether it's Black studies or any other field that takes self-criticism seriously, figuring out ways to proliferate those ands and when we tell stories is such a challenge. I mean, I'm not going to pretend to know how, if I knew what the formula was to make that happen, I would let everybody know. But I think that's a fantastic challenge because I don't know if it's a dialectic. I guess we'll see if it's a dialectic or just a dynamic of contradictions and contraries. But the way that excluded people's stories get told and sort of what comes after the proliferation of those excluded stories having a presence and being told. That for me is such an interesting question, and one that's hard to take up in a moment of dispute and in a moment of assertion of subaltern voices. But it's a question that as you're indicating is natural, and also the I don't want to say the benefits, but the what comes out of that proliferation has so much promise and so much richness. So I love that.
Yeah, I really tried to write my book in a inclusive way. Although of course it centers on the masculine figure of Hubert Harrison, I really try to talk about the women that shaped him and that he was interacting with, not just Black women, but white radical women. People like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and Emma Goldman, Rose Pastor Stokes, Black women like Ida B. Wells and Grace Campbell and Victoria Matthews and Frances Reynolds Keyser and all these. There's a whole there's a whole number of folks that he's engaged with because, he was working in the White Rose Home for Colored Girls under the direction of Frances Reynolds Keyser. This is like Black women's club work, right? He was fighting for a Black woman's right to vote, working with people like Eslanda Cardoza Good, mother of the future Eslanda Robeson. And he was also Harrison was a free lover, and I love the chapter that I did there. It's called Black Free Love Politics and the Queer New Negro, because one of the things that happens in the so-called Renaissance, is a whole range of Black sexualities and experimentations. Perhaps the best example of which are the blues women, right, who in their lyrics are giving voice to women's bodily autonomy, same-sex, relationships among women, non-monogamous relationships among women, and all number of, sort of queer sexualities that are being experimented with. So I try to, again, it's never going to be perfect, and there's no formula for this. But I really try, as much as I'm writing about, a male figure, I really tried to show the role of women and queer folks and tell a comprehensive story, so that we're not just doing one or the other, right? As I mentioned.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, in the end, this is an empirical question. Like, how do we make our books? How do we make our articles? So I like that as try again.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the dynamic of making that different kind of scholarship, not just possible but actual. So, well, let me ask a last question then, and maybe in some ways that's already an answer to it. But in the context of a sort of future of the field of Black studies, as an institutional context or non-institutional context, what is the question you think is most urgent, or what is the issue you would want us all to be thinking about?
Yeah, and this is also something that I draw from my study of Harrison, but it's this idea of integrating multiple different things, right? Rather than picking one and polemicizing against the rest. I think too often we've been in a place where we pick one thing and we polemicize against the other. So we pick Black Marxism and then we polemicize against everything else. Or we pick Black feminism and we polemicize against everything else, right? Or we pick Afro-pessimism and we're polemicizing against everything else. I think I would rather see. I'm reminded of a quote by Audre Lorde where she talks about how it was going to take some time for Black studies to come to realize that its place, its center, was the very house of difference rather than the security of any one particular difference, right? So this idea that your difference as Black, being a Black man, or your difference as a Black woman compared to a Black man, that it's not that particular difference, but it's the house of difference and the many differences that we could explore that is really the grounding wire for the future of Black studies. And so the question there is what would it mean to actually integrate all the different gender identities and how we tell our histories, right? Rather than fighting gender wars or playing some type of oppression Olympics about who's more oppressed. What would it mean to integrate Afro-pessimist approaches to all the others, to Marxist approaches and feminist approaches, and some of the post-colonial or anti-colonial approaches that are there. Because at the end of the day, there's multiple systemic injustices that are kind of responsible for our oppression and domination. And so if we want to get to the root of those injustices, we need a method that is able to integrate the insights from any and all frameworks that point us toward a root cause. So if feminism is pointing us toward a root cause about, toxic patriarchal or sexist, antagonisms in society, let's integrate those insights, right? If Marxism is telling us about class struggle and class domination and exploitation, and the more acute versions of that are suffered by Black workers, let's integrate those insights, right? If Afro-pessimism is talking about the world is anti-Black and anti-Blackness actually is older than capitalism, because it goes into the Arab enslavement of East Africans, the Islamic experience of Africans under slavery, long before there was a Black Atlantic or Europeans, colonizing the Americas. Let's integrate that. Let's understand anti-Blackness as a systemic oppression of its own, right? The point being that the academy, unfortunately, I think pushes us to pick one framework and polemicize against everything else because it's how we define our individuality as scholars or our individual, contribution. And there's a certain kind of capitalist and competitive logic that I think can distort that. Whereas if we could actually integrate and try to synthesize more, right? Do more synthesizing and less sort of polemicizing. I mean, there's a time for that. There's a time for polemical argument, but if the goal is liberation, I guess that's perhaps what I'm not speaking about here. If the goal is Black liberation, then we need to learn from and take seriously the very simple counsel of figures like Malcolm X, who said we need to get this thing done by any means necessary. And so if Marxism or Afro-pessimism or feminism or anything else adds to the toolbox of, weapons in the struggle, why should we deny ourselves access to any or all of those tools, right? I think we should actually try to integrate them and see how they get stronger when they're combined with one another, not weaker.
What a wonderful place to conclude this conversation, which has been so interesting. There's so much in this for people to take away and think about and really contemplate. And this last bit from you is just immensely important and really, really interesting. So thank you for that. I'm really happy that we wrap up in this on this particular note. I think it's such an important thing for us to think about, in the next 50 years of Black studies, but as you also say, the next however many years of Black liberation struggle, which is not unrelated to study.
Right.
So thank you so much, man. I really appreciate your time, but I really appreciate your seriousness and your thoughtfulness in this conversation. It's been fantastic. It's an awesome contribution to the series.
Thank you so much, John. And I hope we can have, more engagements in the future, especially if you get a chance to read my book, because I think I really tried to synthesize and pull together a lot of the elements that I've spoken about today in the book, and I would love to get your take on whether I succeeded or to what extent I succeeded or not.
Well, I'm sure it's a success, but I can't wait to learn from it, and yes, absolutely talk about it with you more. So
thank you.
Well, have a great rest of your day, and take care of yourself.
All right, you too. Thanks, John.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.